Okay, so we're back on our topic of cluster feeding. And the biggest question I received when I was asked about cluster feeding is, you know, is cluster feeding normal? And you know what? For the most part, it can be. Now, that does not mean there aren't times we should be concerned about cluster feeding. And I'll dive into that in a little bit. I want to start out just by talking about, first of all, what is it? And then talk about when it is normal. So, cluster feeding, in a nutshell, is when your baby decides to cluster or group several feedings together in a short span of time. Some people think that cluster feeding is something that lasts all day, and really it shouldn't. That's more of those red flag things when things are not normal, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Let's go back to what is normal though. Your baby clustering or grouping several feedings together in a short span is normal. And typically what this looks like, in most cases, not all, but in most cases when we're talking about cluster feeding, we're talking about your baby nursing like 3 or 4 times from, let's say, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And there's a few thought processes a few theories on why this happens, and a couple theories about why it happens at this time. So you might have heard of the term the witching hour, and it's not really an hour, it's really more of a period of time. And the witching hour is usually a time period that happens in the evening between the hours of like 6 to 10 p.m. And this is usually when your baby tends to get a little bit more cranky. You see them be a little bit more fussy. They tend to be harder to settle, and they tend to want to be on the breast a lot during this time. And some people think it's because during this window of time in the evening, your milk production is at its slowest because your milk production is largely hormone based, and your milk supply tends to be more abundant in the morning, kind of peaking like in those early morning hours in the middle of the night, and kind of slows down a little bit throughout the day. So that's one school of thought, is that babies tend to be fussier at the breast when the milk production is a little bit slower. That does not mean your supply is low in the evening. The only thing it means is that your milk production just takes a little bit longer to refill or regenerate. You are in constant milk production mode. It just comes out a little bit slower. It's like running the faucet on a trickle rather than having it on full blast. So I have to say, I've definitely seen this in my private practice. I see babies who have a flow preference where they really like milk when it is fast and moving and they don't have to work too hard for it. So it is possible that some babies get fussier in the evenings and have a little bit of a harder time because that milk is not coming out on full blast, and it's coming out more like a trickle. Another theory behind why babies might have this witching hour or cluster feeding phase is that towards the end of the day, babies have just taken in so much sensory overload and so much stimulation that their brains are just like, I am done. I can't take any more of this. I've been awake too much today, or there's been too much happening. This is really common when you have a really big eventful day. Babies just tend to have a harder time. Newborn babies especially tend to have a harder time in the evening because now they have to process all of the sensory information that they took in from their day, and it can be hard on their little bodies. During the first 6 months, their brains are doing a lot of development, and all of their neural pathways are being set, and they can get cranky and frustrated really easily, especially when they're going through these big developmental leaps. And sometimes that can lead to this witching hour phase that they have, or cluster feeding. So keep those two things in mind when you were thinking about cluster feeding. It normally happens in the evening, and it can very often be because they are just stressed out, they're tired, they're overwhelmed, they're overstimulated, or maybe they're a little bit frustrated with the slower flow of milk. Another reason that a baby could cluster feed is if they tend to take longer naps or longer sleep stretches during the day. Now, if we're talking about a newborn baby, like a super newborn baby, less than 4 to 6 weeks old, your milk production's not fully established yet in this phase, by the way, it takes about 6 weeks for your breast milk to fully establish, in case you didn't know. During this newborn phase, if your baby is sleeping for 4-hour stretches more than once a day, that's a red flag. And that's something that I would want to know. So if that's you and your newborn is going through this, please reach out to me so that we can do a telehealth consultation, because I want to make sure that you and your baby are establishing a healthy milk supply and that your baby is getting the milk that they need. So if that is you, like I said, please reach out, because that in itself is a red flag. But if your baby is past that stage and they're sleeping longer stretches throughout the day, breastfeeding is well established, no concerns about weight supply or anything like that. I'm talking about the normal course of breastfeeding here, right? Making that distinction now. So your baby older than 6 weeks, about 2 months old, let's say, is sleeping longer stretches during the day, and good stretches at night as well. They may cluster feed in the evening to make up for some of these feedings that they might have gotten during the day if they had otherwise been awake. So sometimes we hear people talk about growth spurts, right? And this is not really research-based. This is more anecdotal, but I hear people talking about it a lot, is that they will tend to notice that their babies will cluster feed right before they go into a developmental leap. Or sometimes I'll hear people talk about it the other way around. Their baby will have a developmental leap, sleep a little bit more, and then afterwards they're cluster feeding. And this is something that has been talked about widely in breastfeeding communities for a really long time. And I think that there might be some truth to that. But what I want to point out here is that cluster feeding is something that is typically, though cluster feeding can be normal, it's typically is something that happens only like once a day. It's not something that babies do multiple times throughout a day. It's usually, they have a good feed in the morning, they sleep a little bit, another feed, a little bit more sleep, another feed, maybe some play, kind of depending on their age. But then come the evening, that's when we'll see several feedings being clustered together. Now, when I'm talking about feedings here, I also think it's important to point out what's normal for an infant. So a baby who is less than a year old, from about birth until the end of that first year, they're going to need about 8 feedings every 24 hours. Now, 8 is kind of the minimum, especially in the newborn phase and leading up to the start of solids, which should happen at 6 months, at about 6 months old, once they meet certain milestones, and then continuing until towards the end of the first year. 8 or more feedings in 24 hours is what's normal. It's not normal for your baby to have a whole lot more than 8 feedings. They sometimes will have more than 8 feedings in a 24-hour period, especially if they're not feeling good, or if they are going through some of these days where cluster feeding happens. We might see the range be more like 8 to 12 in those during those times. But if your baby is regularly nursing very frequently, that is a red flag to me. But what's normal for cluster feeding is when they cluster a normal amount of feedings together among the whole 8. So if they're not going 8 feedings plus like a cluster of 5 feedings on top of that. If they did it once, okay, let's not stress over that. But if your baby is consistently cluster feeding more than normal, that's something that, reach out for support about, because there may be something underlying going on that you're not aware of. Maybe something funky happened with your milk supply and you didn't know. Or, sometimes it happens when your period is about to come back, actually, because your milk supply tends to take a little bit of a dip in the days leading up to your cycle. So that actually can be a normal form of cluster feeding, because your baby is nursing in shorter spurts, kind of clustering some feeds together, trying to boost your milk supply, right? Because cluster feeding can also be nature's way of boosting your milk production, which is why we see it happen in the newborn phase so frequently. During that first 4 to 6 weeks, while your milk supply is working on establishing, we often see newborns cluster feeding. Again, there's some times when cluster feeding in the newborn phase is not normal. We'll get to that. Bear with me. So just making sure feedings are still within the range of normal and you're not finding that your baby is, feeding an exorbitantly high number. Some other times that cluster feeding can be normal when they're teething and they're uncomfortable. When they're not feeling good, cluster feeding can be normal. But again, cluster feeding is one of those things where it usually happens in one chunk once a day. And for the most part, cluster feeding will happen for a couple of days in a row sometimes. But if your baby is regularly cluster feeding, that is a red flag that I would want to know. Some babies just get into the habit of cluster feeding at nighttime. And as long as, baby is happy, baby is healthy, baby is gaining weight well, if your baby is clustering a couple of feedings together between the hours of like 6 to 10 p.m. in the evenings, if it's not bothering you, don't worry about it. But what I will also add here is, if it is bothering you, reach out to lactation support. And I really encourage you not to give a bottle during these times, because if you are worried that your baby is cluster feeding in the evening because you are not enough, number one, go get support for that from somebody like me or another lactation consultant who can help you evaluate that scenario. Because if you start giving a bottle, what will happen is very quickly your milk supply will no longer be enough. Because if you take time away from the breast and replace feedings at the breast with a supplement, that is a fast track to low milk supply. And I can tell you, I have supported many parents through this who didn't realize how big of a risk that actually is, and started supplementing in the evening when their baby was cluster feeding, not realizing that that's actually normal for some babies, and then truly damaging their milk production. And depending on the age of the baby, it can be really hard to kind of spring that back, especially if you've been doing it for a while. So if you are worried about cluster feeding, reach out for support. But if all else is going well, your baby is thriving, and you don't mind the cluster feeding, don't stress about it. So let's talk about the stuff that I kept alluding to that's not normal. So some red flags for me. If you are in the newborn phase and you feel like your baby is at the breast constantly, that's something that I would want to know about, because the two main reasons, and they're kind of opposite ends of the extreme here. If your baby is nursing at the breast constantly, it could mean you have a milk supply problem and that there's something wrong, or your milk production is low. Okay, that's what that could mean. It could mean that your baby is nursing constantly because they're actually really hungry and there's not enough milk there. Now, you would know that if there was a weight concern, if your baby wasn't stooling adequately, if there wasn't enough wet diapers. And if that was the case, get support ASAP. Do not wait. Find somebody who specializes in lactation to support you through this, okay? Because just bottle feeding and supplementing with formula, though if you are producing, if you do have a low milk production, formula supplementation may be an option to consider, but it's not the only thing to do. You should also get support to help your body improve your milk production, right? And seek lactation support. You can work with me if you want to in my telehealth practice, or go find somebody else near you who can support you and guide you through your milk production and increasing milk supply, because that will be crucial. The other concern that I would have if your baby is nursing constantly at the breast is that the opposite end of things, all of that stimulation and that extra nursing, especially in the newborn phase, could very quickly lead you to oversupply. And if you follow me at all, you will know that I talk about oversupply all the time, because that is my thing, is supporting people through milk supply problems, specifically milk's overproduction of breast milk, because that can cause issues in your baby down the line. It can cause issues for yourself, like frequent clogs, mastitis. It can also make your baby really gassy and fussy and give them symptoms that are very similar to food intolerance and dairy allergy as well. So if you can avoid that, please do. Now, there are some common reasons why babies tend to do this, even if your milk supply is not low. Okay. So if you are overproducing, but your baby is still nursing a whole lot, or you have an adequate supply and your baby is still nursing a whole lot, and you're down that road to being overstimulated and overproducing, right? There are a few reasons why this happens. And the number one reason that I see this happen, actually, and no offense, guys, I don't mean this in a bad way, but I am a firm believer that supported is best and informed is best. But the number one reason why I see this happening is that parents are misreading and misinterpreting their baby's cues. So in a nutshell, what that means is you think your baby's hungry, but they are not. What I will say here is that the diaper output does not lie. What goes in must come out. So if your baby is stooling adequately for their age, then or they're stooling more than they should be. If your baby is stooling more than they should be based on their age, that should be a clue to you that you are overfeeding or they are eating more than they need to. And you are probably on that spectrum of overproduction. The diapers don't lie. So check into that. Why is your baby cluster feeding? Is your baby actually hungry? And I actually have a really great breakdown of satiety signals, hunger cues, and another one, discomfort cues, where I break down the difference between them, what they mean, and how to tell what it is that your baby's trying to communicate with you. This is one of the number one tools that I use with my private clients because it is true for almost every baby. It's true for neurotypical babies who are in their, newborn window up to about 2 to 3 months when they start to lose those reflexes. But there are some very obvious cues and signals that your baby will use to communicate hunger and satiety or discomfort, which is the confusing one, right? This is what leads people to confuse that their baby is still hungry after feeding and lead to cluster feeding, where cluster feeding does not need to happen. And discomfort looks very similar to hunger. So if you know the difference between these cues, it could save you some headaches, could save you from all this cluster feeding, could lead you down the road to some other tactics that you could use, like my proven magic baby hold, which you can find on my YouTube channel, and other things to help soothe your baby during this time to prevent them from overstimulating your body, which is further going to prevent you from landing on that spectrum of overproduction. So those are 2 red flags that you want to look for when it comes to cluster feeding. Is your baby, actually hungry? Could there be a supply problem? Or maybe your baby doesn't need to nurse in this moment and they're trying to communicate something else to you. So those are the 2 biggest red flags that I would have. I also want to say, if your baby suddenly starts cluster feeding out of nowhere, and I kind of touched on this a few minutes ago, but I want to circle back to it. If your baby starts cluster feeding out of nowhere and you've not yet had the return of your cycle, I'd want you to check in with one of 2 things. Number 1, is your cycle about to return? Because this is usually one of the first signs we see is your baby will be usually a little bit older, not always, because sometimes you get a nice long break in the return of your cycle when you're breastfeeding, and sometimes you don't. And if you're one of those, I'm sorry, I'm with you. Solidarity. My last baby, I got no break, none at all. But that could be a sign that your cycle is about to return. And it sometimes is accompanied with some nipple tenderness and a little bit of bitchiness too, at least in my case. And then another one is pregnancy. Some breastfeeding is not a form of contraception. Some people believe that it is not. You don't have your cycle, but you will ovulate before your cycle returns. So it is not an effective form of birth control. So please do not rely on lactation and breastfeeding, chest feeding as a form of birth control, because it is not. And you absolutely can get pregnant while you are feeding your baby. So keep that in mind, because what does happen when you do get pregnant is that your milk supply very quickly starts to dwindle and decrease. And I actually just did a video about this in the Facebook group last week. It's also on my YouTube channel about tandem nursing and what that's like. And I talked about all of the milk supply changes that happen when you do become pregnant again. So sometimes we see babies are cluster feeding, or we start to see weirdness in weight or diaper output, and we're like, what the heck is going on? And that's one of the first questions I ask. Is there any chance you could be pregnant? Because I have had many clients be very surprised to find out that that was the cause of cluster feeding, or their decrease in milk production, or reason why their baby's weight or stools got weird all of a sudden. So in a nutshell, I'm going to recap almost everything I talked about here, I think. In most cases, cluster feeding can be normal as long as it's happening usually just in one chunk throughout the day. If your baby is cluster feeding multiple times throughout the day, that is something that I, as your lactation support person, I would want to know that. I really would, because there may be a reason why it's happening. Maybe there's oral restriction, which I didn't talk about too much or at all, I think, in this episode. Or maybe there's another reason why your baby is cluster feeding that could point to an issue like low milk production, or misreading of cues, because like I said, the other issue with too much cluster feeding is overproduction, which can lead to a lot of issues. And if you guys want to know more about that, check out my blog, Is Dairy Causing a Problem for My Breastfed Baby? And you might be surprised by what that blog is actually about. The title is misleading. And it talks about all the stuff and issues that come with overproduction of breast milk. I'll post links to all of that in the description of this episode as well, so you guys can easily find it. But if you think that your cluster feeding is not normal, let me know. Come talk to me. We can set up an appointment and check things out, or go see another lactation support person near you who can guide you through navigating cluster feeding and helping you figure out whether or not your baby's cluster feeding patterns are typical. But it is very common. It can be normal, so don't stress too much as long as your baby is doing well, thriving, gaining weight like they should be, and you are also comfortable with it. All right, guys, that is it for this episode. Until next time.